Morning everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Leases in Uncertain Times. My name is Stephen Smith. I'm the country manager at Stewart Title Limited, and I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Mark Shelton. Mark is a freelance legal trainer, having practiced in major commercial law firms, including Linklaters, Lawrence Graham, and Evershed Sutherland for 30 years. Mark has always specialised in property litigation and has acted for a number of major property investors, financial institutions and leading retailers. Mark is a contributor to Estates Gazette, Property Week and Property Law Journal, and is the author of the Lease Guide website and several books on commercial leases. Mark, good morning and thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Steve. Thank you.
Before I pass over to Mark, those of you that are familiar with our webinars, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items in order for you to participate in today's session. So you are by default listening through your audio through your computer. If you would like to dial through the telephone, you're able to do so just by clicking the telephone option, and that will bring up the details for the toll-free number. So it is free of charge. Sometimes people have some internet issues, so the telephone can sound a bit better. You have the opportunity throughout the session to submit text questions to myself or Mark using the questions pane you have in the control panel. We will be having a designated question and answer session at the end today, so we will tend to save the questions until that point unless there is something very pressing on the particular topic that Mark is talking about at that point. You can also raise your hand at any point during the presentation if you're having some IT issues or any difficulties with the technical side. Also, if you would like to ask a question directly over your microphone or speakers, you can also do that with Mark there. Anyway, no one is here to listen to me today, so without further ado, I will pass on to Mark for the main part of today's presentation. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for that introduction, Steve, and thank you also to Stewart Title for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. This session is really going to be a bit of crystal ball gazing, really. I'm going to be throwing out some ideas as to how commercial landlords and tenants may react to all the uncertainties that face the world at the moment in terms of dealing with commercial leases. It's quite a relaxing session for me and quite a relaxing session for you, and for you because there's not going to be no great kind of technical issues to bend your brain to, and for me because as it's crystal ball gazing, nobody will know whether I'm wrong for years to come. So that's all great, but of course you may well have different ideas from what I'm going to say, and that's great. I hope at the end we'll have some discussion and some questions, and all learn from one another. But anyway, I'll crack on and talk about uncertain times, and really they couldn't be much more uncertain, could they? I'll just start off by sort of giving a bit of background, but it's basically all stuff that you know about, just telling you what you already know for a couple of minutes. We've had obviously for the past 3 or 4 months, the news agenda has been dominated by COVID-19 and the lockdown and the emergence from it, and of course Brexit has sort of rather receded into the background. People may have forgotten about that a little bit, but that deadline is looming. 31st December 2020, the UK will cease to be part of the EU single market and the customs union. It's entirely possible that the UK and the EU won't have achieved a free trade deal by then. So from the 1st of January, cross-border movement of goods could be subject to customs checks. Tariffs could be payable at WTO levels, all of which could lead to a loss of competitiveness. Everybody has their own ideas and own passionately held views very often about the consequences of different forms of Brexit. What I think is interesting to me is the extent to which the COVID-19 crisis has already brought, or seems very likely to bring, some of the adverse consequences which have been predicted by some people, at least, for Brexit. So most businesses have suffered labour shortages, disrupted supply chains, shortage of goods, very much part and parcel of the COVID-19 experience. And of course, I guess we all wait with bated breath to see what the medium and long term will bring in terms of the economic consequences of COVID-19. But it seems highly likely that it will include at least a recession of some length and some depth, and inflation and increased unemployment, all consequences which people have talked about in relation to the consequences of Brexit. So two major challenges facing not only, of course, the commercial property world, but business in general and society in general. Being a bit more specific, certain sectors, the retail sector, the office sector specifically, have been facing other pressures and uncertainties for some years, and they seem likely just to be intensified really by the effect of COVID-19 and Brexit. So just to talk specifically about office lettings, the growth in flexible office lettings has been very much a feature of recent years, and that is in turn a threat to traditional office lettings, and this is a trend that seems very much likely to continue and to be accelerated and intensified by the COVID-19 experience. What do I mean by flexible office arrangements? Well, not only the kind of familiar, relatively well-established serviced office space arrangements pioneered by the likes of Regus a few years ago, but also now co-working, so-called vertical campuses in which occupiers may take, say, one or more floors within a building as core offices, but they also benefit from sharing some centralized services, other facilities like social spaces and so forth. There's a number of established providers in that sector. WeWork, Workspace. Their occupier base so far has tended to be small and medium-sized enterprises, but larger corporates are now also beginning to use flexible arrangements of this sort. And that's not only for their own occupancy, but it may be that they have space to which they have a longer-term commitment, which has become surplus, and they can offer it to other occupiers on these kind of flexible terms, provided the alienation clause allows. And this is in a world where business plans are increasingly being drawn up for shorter periods, a year, maybe even a quarter. So in that context, being committed to a lengthy institutional lease is not very attractive, and particularly when one takes into account the impact of International Financial Reporting Standards 16, whereby lease commitments of over 12 months are brought onto an occupier's balance sheet. Also, of course, we've had and continue to have dramatic changes in employee working patterns. We've all just had, and well, we're still enjoying this enforced mass experiment in home working and using the technology for home working, like this webinar, for example. And a lot of this was in use anyway, but the use has become very much more widespread. People who weren't used to using this sort of technology have discovered that it works, or at least it works well enough. And it's probably not going to be that, this is how work looks now for the foreseeable future, but this is increasingly going to be a part of how work looks for the foreseeable future. All of which means that occupiers are increasingly looking for shorter terms. They're looking for flexible break terms, and investors are having to swallow that. As for retail, well, the high street has been under pressure for a number of years. That's no secret, and major retailers entering into insolvency processes, that's been a regular feature of the press. We can always walk down our local high street and see the high levels of vacancies of retail units, charity shops taking up the space and so forth. And of course, an awful lot of that is to do with the challenge from online retailing. Well, retailers have responded to the difficulties by trading in different ways, but they require more flexible lease terms. So increasingly, they're looking to share space with concessionaires or franchisees, maybe irrespective of restrictions in the use clause, but it allows them to freshen up their offer, to liven up the mix of occupiers. And landlords, by and large, tend to be amenable to that because it enables the traders to offer a variety of reasons for people to attend the shopping centre. Experiential retailing, that's the buzz phrase, with retailers offering classes in crafting and cookery and so forth. As in the office sector, of course, shorter terms have been prevalent. That trend is likely to continue. It just limits tenants' exposure. Pop-up lettings are often talked about. They've been a feature of the retail landscape for a number of years now. And whereas they were initially rather left field, sort of eccentric sort of arrangements, they're now mainstream. And Westfield, for example, dedicates space to pop-ups in all of their centres worldwide. It's not just startup left field businesses who are using pop-ups. It's major brands. So the luxury travel brand Kuoni, for example, uses pop-ups. BMW uses pop-ups to promote its mini brand. So all of this is going to probably intensify and accelerate as a result of the coronavirus. And as regards the effect of the coronavirus, obviously the impact upon retail has been dramatic and severe. And it might have been hoped that online sales would take up a major part of the slack, but that seems to have happened only to a very limited sort of degree. Really, I think because the supply chain infrastructure which might allow that to happen, it just isn't there. There aren't enough vans, drivers, logistics centres, and so forth. So we've had a new wave of insolvencies on the high street. Collegios, Cath Kidston, Debenhams, Warehouse, Oasis, Frankie and Benny's, Monsoon, Accessorize. We can doubtless expect many more in the following months. So all of that background, all of these uncertainties raise a number of issues for both occupiers and investors. They're partly issues to do with negotiating the crisis on the basis of existing lease terms, but there are also issues about what kind of terms people may be looking for in future. So you can group them, I think, under these sort of 5 sectors, which is what I'll be talking about for the next half hour or so. So first of all, where you have landlords who want to take an approach which is supportive rather than enforcement based in the present crisis, they're very often entering into concession agreements. Well, what issues do landlords need to be thinking about in relation to concessionary arrangements? So we'll come on to talk about that. Also, if there are future public health crises or widespread deep recessions, widespread closure of premises by tenants, what options have landlords got? Can they close down multi-let premises like shopping centres or office complexes? Or can they reduce or suspend provision of services? So we'll think about what options may be available to landlords there. In extraordinary circumstances like the COVID-19 pandemic, or perhaps a deep recession following Brexit, if that's going to be the outcome of that, tenants may be led to close their premises. Well, other things being equal, they're going to look to try to get out of their lease liabilities and not to have to pay rent on premises which they're not going to be occupying anymore. So what routes to lease termination are open to tenants? That's the next kind of topic to talk about. And leading on from that, because looking ahead, the answer is that there aren't many routes to lease termination. But leading on from that, where tenants have closed their premises but their lease is continuing, what are the issues for them in terms of practical arrangements, in terms of continued liability on lease covenants? And then finally, where does that all take us in terms of what terms people are likely to be looking for in relation to future leases? So those are our topics, and we'll start by talking about concession agreements. And plenty of landlords are now assisting tenants by agreeing rental concessions of various sorts, and indeed assisting themselves because it promotes the sustainability of the tenants' businesses. Now, of course, there's the encouragement of the government's new code of practice for commercial property relationships, which is supposed to encourage people to collaborate and to work together to get through the crisis. In my view, it's quite a lot of motherhood and apple pie. There's not an awful lot of real substance in it. And I saw this morning that Mike Ashley's Fraser's Group, incorporating Sports Direct and Evans Cycles and a variety of other brands, has been writing to landlords saying essentially, from now on, we're not going to pay you any more rent indefinitely into the future, which hardly seems in accordance with the spirit of the code. So the code doesn't seem to be having a kind of salutary effect upon everybody, but we'll see how all that pans out in future. But plenty of landlords are working in a collaborative way with tenants and agreeing rent concessions, and that might be a deferment, a postponement of rental liability. It might be a switch from quarterly to monthly payment, or a switch from payment in advance to payment in arrear. It might be granting a rent-free period, a rent holiday, or reducing the amount of the rent temporarily or permanently, or reducing the amount of service charge. Other arrangements might be an agreement for the landlord to draw down monies held from an existing rent deposit rather than seeking immediate payment of any sums due or immediate top-up of the rent deposit, or switching to a turnover-based rent. So these are all kinds of things that are happening in the market at the moment, and they may give us some clues as to what people are looking for in terms of future leases as well. Now, any of these things, it's a concession to a tenant, therefore it's on the face of it unwelcome to the landlord. But of course, a negotiation over a concession is an opportunity for a landlord to ask for something back, something in return. And that might be taking a break option out of a lease. It might be settling a rent review. It might be extending the term. All of those things are happening in the market at the moment. And we're kind of in familiar territory a little bit here, actually, because the 2008 financial crisis also gave rise to a lot of concession agreements between landlords and tenants. And really the lesson learned from that period is there are a number of knock-on implications of rent concessions which landlords have got to keep in mind and have got to not lose sight of, starting with the role of successors in title. Now, a concession is usually going to be personal to the present tenant, so assignees of the lease won't have the benefit of it. But if it's going to last for a significant period, then it may be important to the tenant that it should bind the landlord's successors in title. Now, that's going to be problematic for landlords, generally speaking, because it's going to affect the value and the marketability of their interest. But there may well be discussions about that. And the point for landlords really is that unless the concession agreement expressly in its terms is made personal to the present landlord, there is a risk, a high risk, that the concession will bind landlord's successors in title pursuant to the Landlord and Tenant Covenants Act of 1995. So it's something that must be addressed in the drafting. It mustn't be overlooked. Guarantors. Landlords are going to need to ensure that any guarantors of the tenant's covenants in the lease are party to the documentation and consent to the concession being given. It's the only absolutely sure way of preventing those guarantors being released completely from their obligations inadvertently, pursuant to an old case, a case dating about 1878, but it still comes back to bite us, the case of Home and Brunskill. And that risk is there particularly if the arrangement is being documented in a formal deed of variation, but it's also there if it's being documented in the form of a side letter. So very important to get guarantors to join in. There are other consents that may be required. The landlord's interest may itself be a leasehold one, in which case there's a superior landlord, and almost certainly their consent to the concession is going to be required. The landlord may have charged its interest or mortgaged its interest, in which case the lender's consent is likely to be required as well. Then there's kind of mechanics of the arrangement itself. So if you're talking about a deferment, a postponement of rent, well, of course, there's got to be a payment plan set out for the deferred amount. The parties have also got to agree if any interest is going to be payable on the deferred amount, and if so, at what rate and from what date. If the deferment is being paid by installments, then a very common arrangement might be that if the tenant is late or defaults in paying one installment, then that accelerates payment of all the other installments, which immediately become due. So these are things to think about. As to termination, well, naturally, of course, you've got to specify how long any concession is going to last, but landlords may also want to have the ability to bring it to an end early, perhaps in the event of tenant insolvency, perhaps in the event of breach of other covenants in the lease, and so forth. And then landlords may well want to set out some consequences of early termination of the concession. So, for example, if the concession takes the form of a reduction in the amount of rent, then upon termination of the concession, the general principle the expectation would be the original rate of rent would then become payable again from the date of termination. Sometimes you see provisions where not only does it become payable from the date of termination of the concession, but it's actually backdated all the way through the concessionary period. And a clause of that nature was dealt with in a case called Vivian Westwood and Conduit Street Developments in 2017. and the court decided that that was an unenforceable penalty because the detriment which it imposed upon the tenant was out of all proportion to the consequences of the tenant's breach. So when one is putting that kind of clause in place, one needs to be careful to make sure that it's proportionate in one way or another. Does the concession only apply to rent? If it does, that's nice and simple. Tenants may argue for it to apply to service charge and other sums as well, in which case you've got a bit more thinking to be done about the role of year-end balancing payments and how they're dealt with. Or for turnover rent leases, it's easy enough to apply a concession to the base rent. Applying it to the top-up element, the turnover-based element, is a bit more complicated. What about rent reviews? Is there an outstanding rent review? How is any increase affected by the concession arrangement? Or is there an upcoming rent review? Again, how is any increase affected, but also will the concession be disregarded upon the rent review? So lots and lots of things to bear in mind when documenting rent concessions. So that's what I wanted to say in relation to that topic. Moving on to landlords' options, where they're talking, where landlords may be considering closing development, whether it's a shopping centre or an office complex or something else. Pretty unlikely that a landlord is going to be thinking of closing an entire development in that way. I've never seen any clause in lease documentation where a landlord has that right. You tend not to see force majeure clauses in leases. We'll come back to those in a bit. And therefore, in the absence of any contractual right, a landlord who closes a development down is going to be committing some serious breaches of their leases. They're going to be breaching quiet enjoyment. It's going to be derogation from grant. And they face a risk of tenants turning around to them and saying, well, you've repudiated the lease, I accept your repudiation, and that's it, the lease is at an end, and they're left with a totally untenanted development. I've not seen any examples or heard of any examples during the COVID-19 crisis of landlords seeking to close developments down. And I think it's a very, very serious step and probably quite unlikely. But landlords may look at closing access to parts of the common areas of a development. If you have a deep, long recession, that might be arising out of COVID-19, it might be arising out of Brexit or a combination of the two, and there are then high levels of retail vacancies, well, landlords may want to close some or all of the common parts of shopping centres, for example. Obviously, the layout of the centre would have to be such that that would still be possible while preserving access for any tenants who are still trading, who still wanted to occupy their premises. Well, can landlords do that? Quite often they probably can, because landlords are generally entitled under multi-let development leases to implement reasonable regulations for the management of the building. And that might well permit suspension of access to some or all of the common parts. So that may well be something that's open to landlords under existing leases. For common leases, for new leases rather, obviously that's something that landlords may now think about introducing specific provision for. So a right to close common parts being triggered by certain circumstances. And one thing that's been suggested is a vacancy threshold. If the vacancies in the centre fall below a certain percentage, or exceed, sorry, a certain percentage of the centre's total trading space, that might trigger a right to close common parts. And that sort of provision obviously is going to be very controversial. Tenants may not be very happy to agree to that, but we may see that kind of thing being discussed and being negotiated in future. What about services? I mean, that is probably more of a concern for landlords really than closing common parts altogether, is cutting expenditure by reducing or suspending the provision of services. Now, service charge provisions may have some absolute obligations on landlords to provide services, but very commonly they provide the landlord has to use reasonable endeavours to provide services, and usually to their specific provision, relieving landlords from liability in the event that they fail to provide services, if that happens for reasons beyond their control. So that's very apt for present circumstances. If staff shortages, supply chain difficulties, shortage of goods, perhaps even power cuts were to prevent the provision of services, then it may well be existing lease terms would protect the landlord. They'd be entitled to suspend or limit the provision of services. Again, in new leases, landlords are going to be making sure that they are watertight in that regard, and they have provisions limiting or excluding liability in the appropriate circumstances. Again, possibly a vacancy threshold might be one way of providing for that. So that's not providing services. What about the other side of the coin, where extraordinary circumstances prompt landlords to spend more, to incur additional expenditure on services? Will they recover that increase from tenants? And this has been an issue through the COVID-19 crisis. Additional cleaning of common parts has been the first issue that really cropped up. Well, always the answer to these questions is you've got to look at what the lease says, it would be unusual, though, to come across a service charge provision which did not provide for the landlord to recover costs of cleaning. So landlords have been able to, generally speaking, to recover costs of the additional costs of cleaning in response to COVID-19. I mean, as businesses are coming out of lockdown, there are other issues, because landlords have had to look at recommissioning plant and equipment which has not been used for some months. They've had to look at taking further measures in relation to common areas, like cutting the capacity of particular rooms by removing seating, signposting walking directions, allocating a separate isolation room for people with symptoms, putting in place temperature screening at reception, or disabling touch screens, removing shared items which are frequently touched, like remote controls, moving to no or low touch doors or switches and light fittings. All of these things, of course, with a cost. And again, as always, you've got to look at the individual terms of the lease. Probably in these circumstances, landlords are relying upon the so-called sweeper clause in the service charge provision, a provision which allows the landlord to add to or vary the provision of services, usually where it's reasonable to do so, very often where it's in accordance with the principles of good estate management. And it's true that the courts tend to construe these clauses quite strictly against landlords, but really these are exactly the kind of circumstances, unforeseen circumstances, where the sweeper charge is designed to help out, is designed to allow the landlord to provide additional services and recover the cost. So many landlords are starting from a very good position in seeking to establish that these costs are recoverable. Of course, there's always going to be argument about whether costs are reasonable in amount, whether they've been reasonably incurred, whether the landlord has exercised its discretion correctly, and that's just a matter of individual cases. Again, in new leases, landlords may consider more specific provision for providing additional services in response to public health crises, for example. So moving on to my third kind of group of issues, this is to do with termination of leases. And tenants who have closed their premises, maybe voluntarily, maybe compulsorily, can they establish that their lease has been terminated and therefore they're relieved from lease liability? Really, the only firm basis upon which tenants can rely for that is if there's express contractual provision in the lease. And it might be to do with the length of term. You know, we are in a period where shorter leases are the norm. Leases of 3 years or less are not uncommon. So for quite a number of tenants, there may not be that long left to go, and maybe the exposure to continued rental liability is therefore unwelcome, but not absolutely disastrous. Of course, modern leases tend to incorporate more frequent and simplified break rights. So there's an escape route for tenants if they want to bring their rental liability to an end, where they have the benefit of break options. I mentioned flexible office space. I mean, the key to the flexibility, the whole reason for it, is to provide tenants with a ready escape route. And that's very much proved to be the case in relation to COVID-19. So it's been reported, for example, that WeWork has been trading at 35% of its pre-pandemic level. I mentioned force majeure clauses earlier on in connection with whether they might benefit landlords and enable them to close developments. The other side of the coin is, would they benefit tenants and enable them to terminate their leases? You don't very often find force majeure clauses in leases, and really it's a common sort of contractual arrangement. You'll find it very often in construction contracts, but just not very much in leases. Maybe though in longer leases, some older leases, one will see a force majeure clause. Occupiers who operate in sectors where longer leases are the norm, that might be hotel leases or industrial leases. There's a benefit for them to think in terms of introducing force majeure clauses. Some legal systems, like France, for example, they have a definition in the law of what force majeure is, and a definition in the law as to what the consequences are of a force majeure event. And that's not the case in English law. It's purely down to the terms of the contract. So if one is wanting to insert force majeure clauses into leases, one needs to be quite careful in terms of the drafting, the definition of what is a force majeure event and what are the consequences of the force majeure event. It may well be, I think, that people are more accustomed to seeing break options in leases instead, and they really fulfill the same function. And people are therefore perhaps more comfortable with negotiating different forms of break clause. And there have been suggestions that break options might be devised so that a WTO Brexit or some other variant of Brexit would trigger a right to break, or perhaps a government-directed closure of premises, or perhaps the declaration of a pandemic would trigger a right to break. And I think tenants have been asking for this, and as far as I understand it, landlords have been resisting that pretty robustly. It's unlikely, I think, that landlords are going to be willing to agree to give hostages to fortune of that sort. But we may well have negotiations over that in months and years to come. Well, short of an express contractual basis for termination of the lease, one turns to established contractual law principles, frustration of contracts. So, I'll take you back now to undergraduate days when you were first learning about contract law for the very first time. Any kind of contract, including leases, can be terminated by frustration if an event occurs which makes it impossible to perform an obligation, or makes the obligation radically different from what was in the party's contemplation at the time the contract was entered into. Now, back in the time when I was an undergraduate learning about contract law for the first time, the case of National Carriers and Panalpina Northern Limited, decided in 1981, was brand new and the subject of a great deal of commentary. So that's kind of branded into my brain. And that was a case where the House of Lords accepted that in principle, leases, like any other contract, could be terminated by frustration. Not on the facts of that case, the lease was not held to be frustrated, and the House of Lords emphasised that this is something which would happen only in really exceptional circumstances. So, maybe something like the site of a property being obliterated by a volcanic eruption or something of that sort, or perhaps more realistically falling into the sea. We've seen examples of properties falling into the sea as cliff collapses and so forth. In any event, there has been no case in which the courts have held that a lease has been frustrated. We had this rather high-profile case last year, Canary Wharf and European Medicines Agency, in relation to Brexit, where the European Medicines Agency tried to establish that their lease of premises in Canary Wharf had been frustrated, not by the event of Brexit itself, but by the referendum outcome, by the decision of the UK to leave the European Union. They failed. And it is still the case that there is no recorded instance of a frustration argument succeeding in relation to a lease. Maybe a tenant will establish that as a result of COVID-19. Good luck to them. If they do, they'll be making new law, but it's, I would suggest, fairly unlikely. Another contractual law principle which may assist tenants is it's something I've referred to already: acceptance by the tenant of a repudiatory breach on the part of the landlord. Maybe because the landlord has closed common parts, maybe because the landlord has failed to provide services. And here tenants have got a bit more to work with, because there have been occasional instances of leases having been held to be terminated by the tenant having accepted a landlord's repudiatory breach. I think, when one looks at the case law, it is not absolutely clear that this acceptance of repudiation does apply to leases. So the case law is developing. In any event, for it to apply, the landlord's breach would have to be of an absolutely fundamental nature. So perhaps complete denial of access to property, total failure to provide essential services like heating, lighting and water, that kind of thing. So again, it's probably not going to apply most of the time, but it's there as a possibility. One final possibility, I'm not seeing this discussed much actually, which in some ways surprises me a little bit, but a tenant company, if it's a corporate tenant, it may enter into a member's voluntary winding up. That's, in other words, a solvent liquidation, assuming, of course, that the tenant is solvent. Now, once the liquidator has been appointed, the liquidator has power to disclaim the lease by serving notice under Section 178 of the Insolvency Act. It terminates the lease. It doesn't terminate the liability of guarantors. So if, for example, as there generally often will be, there's a parent company guarantee or a director's guarantee, then this is not necessarily a tremendously attractive way forward. It's also really only effectively a solution where you have a company which is a single site operator, a tenant of just the one property, and then you can lose the company, lose the lease, but without any other consequences of the liquidation. Now, if the lease is disclaimed in that way, it's not without a price for the tenant. The landlord can submit a proof of debt, claiming compensation for the loss suffered as a result of the disclaimer. And if the liquidation is going to remain a solvent one, which may be very important for the directors, then the landlord's claim is going to have to be satisfied in full. That doesn't mean you simply accept the landlord's figure. Obviously, there's scope for argument and dispute about that. But the correct basis of assessment of compensation was the subject of a case called Repark Air Services in 1999. And the outcome of that case in terms of pounds and pence is the court reduced the compensation from the landlord's figure, which was 5.4 million, down to just over £1 million. So the procedure is almost like the tenant exercising a put option to require the landlord to take a surrender of the lease upon payment of a reverse premium. It comes at a price to the tenant, but depending upon the circumstances, that may well be worth it. And I think, incidentally, it's something that the risk of this happening, the vulnerability to this happening, is something that landlords ought to be alive to when they're granting leases to single-site tenants. Now, I think as a result of that, we can see that there's not that much in the way of possibility for tenants to terminate their leases unless they've got an express contractual right to do so. So what about circumstances where the premises are closed, but the lease is still continuing? What are the consequences there? What are the issues there? Well, one obvious issue is keep open covenants. For retail tenants, the lease is probably going to contain an obligation to keep the premises open for trade during normal opening hours. What is meant by normal opening hours? It's probably defined in the lease. It may be defined in centre regulations. Landlords may be prepared to agree to vary those opening hours as a concession to tenants, and perhaps in new leases, tenants are going to look for some flexibility. So there's express provision for normal opening hours to be capable of variation or indeed suspension in response to extraordinary circumstances. Or why have a keep open covenant at all? Tenants may just resist that altogether, although keep open covenants are notoriously difficult to enforce, so they're not really that much of a threat to tenants anyway, and they're probably therefore not that high on the shopping list of terms that tenants are going to want to try to resist. But breach of a keep open covenant does give rise to a right to forfeit. In many cases, landlords are not going to be interested in forfeiture, but we had a reported case last year in relation to the administration of BHS, that was SHB realisations and Cribs Mal nominees, where the landlord did forfeit the lease for breach of keep open covenant. So for some tenants, for some premises, there's going to be a value to tenants in trying to resist keep open covenants. Rent, I guess, is the key issue, where you have premises which are closed but where the lease hasn't come to an end. Does the tenant have to continue paying rent? Answer: almost always yes. I mean, yes, of course, there are rent suspension provisions in leases, but for very obvious reasons, the circumstances in which they apply are not likely to include voluntary closure by a tenant, and that's not something which is going to be negotiable in future leases either. But what tenants may do is they may try to negotiate extensions of rent suspension provisions so that they will apply to periods of government-directed closure or public health crisis. Again, it's a bit of a hostage to fortune. Again, it's something that landlords may not be very happy to agree to, but it may be something that we'll see discussed and negotiated in future. One very kind of nuts and bolts practical point is to do with service of notices and monitoring incoming post, because formal legal notices, court papers, can be validly served at the property even though the tenant isn't there. And of course, that's particularly the case if the property is also the tenant company's registered office address, or the address for service which is given at the land registry. Now, plenty of leases will incorporate the service provisions of Section 196 of the Law of Property Act 1925, and that provides, of course, for a number of methods of service, and including, crucially, leaving the document at the demised premises. So tenants need to collect mail from premises. They need to arrange for the post office to redirect mail. That can take some weeks to come into effect, so they still need to be collecting mail from the premises. And it may be that, following the experiences of COVID-19, tenants and also landlords, for the sake of certainty, are going to want to see that the lease permits service of notices by email, or perhaps at least allows parties to nominate a substitute address for service. We talked all the way through this session about some of the implications for new leases and what tenants may be looking for and what landlords may be prepared to grant or not. Let's just kind of round up by thinking about some other implications for new leases. And we're looking at an established trend towards ever shorter lease terms and more frequent break options. That's likely to accelerate. It's likely to intensify in response to COVID. Not in all sectors, of course, but in a lot of them. And one implication of that is a need to keep letting costs to a minimum, because of course, if you let a property for 25 years, you've got one set of letting costs. If you let it on 3-year terms over the same period, you have 8 sets of letting costs. So a lot of pressure on that, and one consequence of that is that some letting agents, some landlords already are beginning to bypass lawyers and simply document leases themselves. And there are some fairly obvious objections and difficulties to that. One of which is that the Legal Services Act of 2007 provides that it's actually a criminal offence for somebody who is not a lawyer, who is governed by the Law Society, to prepare a lease by way of deed specifically. And that may mean that non-lawyers are restricted to preparing leases for terms of less than 3 years, which are not required to be by way of deed under Section 54 of the Law of Property Act 1925. But we're talking about a world in which short lease terms are the norm. So a restriction to preparing leases of 3 years or less may not be that much of a restriction. It may not be that problematic. But I know, for definite, that some agents are preparing leases, some landlords are preparing leases. And while it's a bit of a shock for lawyers, it's really no different from somebody walking into WH Smith's and picking up a will writing kit. The materials are there, the resources are there in the form of standard leases, which are available on the internet cheaply or mostly for free. And these are not just eccentric kind of cobbled together versions. These are, for example, the RICS Small Business Retail Lease, the British Property Federation short-term commercial lease. So if clients and their agents are going to be preparing leases themselves, and of course don't forget, most small businesses, most tenants who take leases will very often do without lawyers, so why not landlords too? And if this is going to happen, what's the role for lawyers? I think that they're not without a role, but the role may be restricted to assisting in selecting an appropriate standard form of lease, which is going to be at least good enough for the particular development or across a portfolio of properties. Perhaps also providing protocols for execution of documents and contracting out of leases and so forth. So we may see that coming. It is already happening, and I think we may see more of it as we go forward. It's also worth saying those two standard forms of leases I just referred to, the RICS and the BPF standard forms, they depart in a pretty radical way from familiar lease forms. So they both provide for the tenant to pay rent at a flat rate, an inclusive rate. The tenant does not pay a service charge, although it may receive services. The tenant does not reimburse insurance premiums. The landlord pays the rates. The tenant does not have a repair obligation. So all of obviously the rent is a little bit higher to reflect these benefits, but all of the fluctuating elements of the property cost, all of the property risk is on the landlord rather than on the tenant. And this is absolutely the antithesis of the traditional FRI lease, the full repairing insuring lease, the clear lease, if you like. So very unfamiliar to landlords, and many landlords are going to be very reluctant to grant leases in this sort of form. But these are not eccentric or left field ideas. These are ideas coming out of established professional bodies. And I think that whether such terms are going to be acceptable to landlords has got to be circumstance dependent. If you look at, for example, premises within, let's say, an aging office development in a poor location, well, landlords are only going to be able to let it on a short term anyway. They're probably going to have to concede a schedule of conditions, so they're not going to be looking at enforcing a full repairing obligation anyway. If it's a short term, let's say 3 years or less, and if in the course of that term significant work needs to be done to common parts, maybe replacement of a flat roof, well, of course, it's going to take a fair bit of persuading that the parties intended that the tenant should be responsible to contribute to a major item like that on the basis of such a limited interest. And the well-known example of that from case law is the case of Scottish Mutual and Jardine Public Relations from 1999. So it may be just realistic to accept these sorts of terms, and in any event, trying to enforce a big service charge claim, trying to enforce repair liability at lease end means clients spending a lot of money on professional fees. Great for you and me, but not so good for them. And what will they get out of it at the end of the day? There will be a financial settlement of some sort. A check of some sort will come the landlord's way. Will the landlord spend it on repairing the premises? Maybe some of it, but they're not obliged to. And very often the existing obligation frameworks that we have don't operate efficiently in relation to securing the maintenance and the repair of buildings, and that outcome is something which can be avoided by simply leaving the repair and maintenance in the landlord's discretion. So inclusive rents, they're not going to be the answer for everything. They're not going to be applicable in all circumstances, but they have their place, and it may well be something that we'll see becoming more popular going forward. But on the topic of rent, turnover rents there's been increasing demand for turnover rents from tenants, and that's something that one can expect to see continuing. Obviously, that's principally in retail premises, leisure and food and beverage leases. They're not unknown in other sectors too, though, and obviously the attractions from the tenant side are pretty obvious. In difficult economic circumstances, poor trading periods, there's a downward adjustment of property costs, so it gives a bit of insulation to the tenant. The landlord is incentivized to make sure the development is well managed and well maintained and fully let. And it's an incentive anyway, but it's a very direct incentive in the case of turnover-based rents. So what's in it for the landlord? Well, the main attraction really is promoting the sustainability of the tenant's business and avoiding void properties. And void property costs are higher than they've ever been. They're much more significant. There's also the possibility that time things pick up and the tenant does extraordinarily well and outperforms, and the landlord gets a much higher rent than it would otherwise if it had let on an open market basis. Anecdotally, that happens. So there's attractions in it from the landlord's point of view. Now, your traditional turnover-based lease has provided for the tenant to pay a base rent around about 75 to 80% of open market rent, plus a top-up element which is calculated upon turnover. But in recent times, we've seen shorter, more flexible retail leases and an increasing use in that context of turnover-only arrangements. And again, I would expect to see this grow as we come past the COVID-19 experience into the post-COVID world. There's no base rent, and for the tenant, that of course is the ultimate in rental flexibility, and that really deals with the issue in relation to rent suspension clauses, because if the premises are closed and the tenant isn't trading, there's no turnover and therefore no rent payable. For a landlord, of course, it means taking on a much higher element of risk, but landlords may regard that as acceptable for short, low-value leases where the tenant's got a very simple business model, and it means that the property is let and they've got rid of the void property costs. So again, I'd expect to see that happening more. Now, the idea of calculating rent based upon turnover is very simple. I'll just express it in 7 words. When it comes to the lease drafting, it's going to be rather more than 7 words. It's probably a 15-page schedule at at the end of the lease, because providing for the detail of the arrangement in lease drafting is far from simple. You've got to anticipate lots of practical implications of the shift away from a fixed rent, changes in trading circumstances, the increase in online trading. Retail and leisure operators are endlessly ingenious in devising new ways of generating turnover. And for landlords, the challenge is making sure that the turnover rent provisions will capture all of the turnover in future. Challenges or not, I think we're going to see this become much more common. Landlords' consent issues, retailers in particular, also office tenants, are going to be looking for flexibility to offer new experience and products. This may involve freedom to share occupation with concessionaires or franchisees, flexibility in the use clause, flexibility in relation to alterations. And what tenants do not want to be doing is continually asking landlord for a formal consent. Even if those requests don't turn out to be contentious, and they quite often do turn out to be contentious, it's expensive and it's slow, and tenants don't want to be doing that all the time. And so they're going to be looking for much more flexibility in those elements of leases. Final topic to talk about, just to round us off, is to do with security for performance, because where you've got economic difficulties, high risk of tenant default, an obvious response is to seek better and more security. I would suggest there's not an awful lot that one can do about that, really. Guarantees have been shown to be vulnerable over recent years. They may disappear upon an assignment of the lease. They may disappear under the terms of a company voluntary arrangement. They may disappear if the lease is varied without the guarantor's consent. So they're vulnerable. Alternatives, of course, a rent deposit, money in the hand, and it's easy and quick to access, so that's great. The practical difficulty is, a tenant who is a weak financial covenant, are they available to put those funds up in the first place? If they do have those funds, will they be willing to tie up capital in that sort of way? And the only alternative really is to look at bank bonds or letters of credit from banks. This is very like a guarantee, really. The tenant defaults, the landlord turns to the bank and the bank pays up. The only real difference is that bank bonds are purely monetary arrangements. In a lease guarantee, the guarantor can be called upon to physically perform the tenant's non-monetary obligations, but not under a bank bond. Banks don't do this for love. They don't do it for nothing. They require a payment from the tenant in return for taking on this risk, like an insurance premium, really. And the amount of that is going to depend upon lots of factors, including the tenant's financial status. At any rate, it's going to be a lot less than the amount of putting up a full rent deposit. So it has that advantage for tenants. For landlords, in the event of tenant insolvency, there's no concern whatsoever, because you're not looking at enforcing against tenants' assets. It's simply a contractual liability on the bank. So lots of advantages to bank bonds, but they're not very often used. And really the limitation is that banks tend to be not very willing to enter into those sorts of arrangements for obvious reasons. And it's really more likely to be significant corporate occupiers who've got the negotiating clout to persuade banks to enter into that sort of arrangement. Well, that brings us to an end of the formal part of the session, and thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been a useful and interesting session for you. Before we go to questions, I hand back to Steve. I'll just point out you do have an email address for me on the slide. I'm always happy to have contact with people and to deal with questions or queries. There's also an address for my training website, marksheltontraining.co.uk. So do please have a look at that as well. But with that, thank you for listening, and I'll hand you back to Steve. We'll see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Mark. I think that was excellent. So yeah, we're just opening up to questions now. We have had a few in already, Mark, but if anyone else would like to ask any questions, please do so via the questions pane on your control panel. But if I can, Mark, I'll move straight ahead with the questions. We've had 3 or 4 in, which is fantastic. Thank you to everyone that submitted one. So a question from Jane Jones. Jane asks, if you have a tenant who is not forthcoming in assisting in the removal of a registered lease, brackets, i.e. providing an ID1, ID3 form after taking advantage of a break option, is there an alternative route? The break clause was exercised nearly 2 years ago and the client is now selling.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, there isn't really anything else one can do to bring the lease to an end because the lease has been brought to an end by exercise of the break option. So it's not as if one can forfeit or then do a statutory declaration for the or a witness statement for for the land registry. It's I'll throw it open because I'm a bit stumped actually as to ideas. I mean, I don't know, Furky, if you're on the line, if it's something that you've got any ideas about. I'll it's rather disappointing, the first question out of the box, that I'm not able to give you very much of an answer for. But no, it's just a difficult one, I'm afraid, as you've no doubt
Yeah,
found. I'm sure you spent the past couple of years exploring all the options that there are, so you probably know an awful lot better than me.
absolutely, Jane. I mean, we can also take that offline as well. We'll speak amongst ourselves, and if we can come up with some sort of answer for that, we will do, of course. So moving forward, Mark, to Robert McNally. Robert asks, Mark, in your view, where a landlord incurs a cost for insuring against business interruption losses, brackets for example, as a result of a pandemic, which is designed to protect the landlord against loss of profit income arising from a business interruption, e.g. say a pandemic, is it arguable in your view that such costs should not be payable by the tenant, brackets under a service charge for example, on the basis that the risk being insured is entirely for the landlord's benefit and not the tenant's? Robert goes on to say, I appreciate the position might be different if the tenant has the benefit of a broad right in its lease to suspend rent in such circumstances, but in the absence of such a broad right.
You have a question directed to the insurance cost, the premiums.
I believe it is, yes. Yeah.
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 I mean, I think it's. I'm afraid it's a bit of a lawyer's answer, which it depends on the terms of the lease. But what the tenant's obliged to pay is obviously a matter of the contractual provision between the parties, if the liability is there in the lease, then of course the tenant must pay. And I think um, obviously people have had experiences in relation to how business interruption insurance has worked, or indeed not worked, during the COVID-19 crisis. And it may be that, armed with that experience, as people come to new leases, they're going to want to exclude that sort of liability in relation to those costs. But otherwise, if the lease says the tenant must pay and it's a debt which is due under the lease, then the tenant must pay, I think would be my approach to that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Robert, for that question. Mark, we have someone come forward, Megan, with potential answer to Jane Jones, who said landlord can send a stat deck to the HMLR to record what happened, and the HMLR may serve notice, but tenant should eventually close. I don't know if you have a view on that, Mark.
Well, that sounds very helpful. That's great. I can't add to that, but thank you for that, Megan.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. Mayumi asks, just a couple more questions, Mark, if I may. So Mayumi asks, could you expand your views on a little more as to the lawyers' roles in license to occupy arrangements between the parties? The property owners tend to have a set license format, and the occupier is unwilling to spend money on legal costs.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very kind of old bugbear, the idea of clients using standard form licenses to occupy in situations where an occupier is actually going to have exclusive possession, and therefore they're actually granting a lease rather than a license to occupy. In kind of training sessions, if I'm talking to clients or surveyors, then it's traditionally been the kind of stance you take to beat clients over the head and say, don't use licenses to occupy, they're too risky. But I've kind of mellowed a bit on that over the years, because licenses to occupy, people use them every day, and they don't use them every day because they blow up in their face every day. There's potential for them to blow up in their face, but very often I think it's a matter of clients having the common sense to kind of touch base with their lawyers every now and again and say, look, you gave us this form of license agreement 10 years ago or 5 years ago or whatever. Is it still use, is it still right? Is it still the kind of form of document we should be using? And lawyers should have, I think, an opportunity to have some input into that and say, well, one of the things you can do is never grant a license to occupy for more than 6 months. Then even if it is a lease, it will not fall within the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. There'll be no security of tenure. Or incorporate provision to move the occupier around to different space, so long as that's not a sham, so long as it's real, so that they don't have exclusive possession of any particular space, and therefore it's more realistic to say it's a license. I think there is a risk for clients just using standard form license agreements without legal input, but as ever, if they're not willing to spend money on legal fees, then they're going to take that risk. But it is hard to know how you can kind of structurally build in an ability for lawyers to have some input in the situation.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mayumi, for that question. We have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to do 2 more, I think, Mark, and then if we get back to anyone else offline, if you're happy with that.
Of course.
So Heidi asks, to assist landlords, do you think that there is scope for putting covenants in the lease for the tenant to secure public sector assistance, brackets, grants, etc., in the case of pandemics?
That's a good thought. I know sometimes in the kind of concession agreements which people have been negotiating, they may be made, or they may be made conditional upon tenants applying for whatever relief is available. There may be clawback provisions so that any relief which is obtained in that way gets paid over to the landlord to kind of offset the effect of the concession. It's a slightly aggressive sort of approach, but it is happening. And why not have it in the lease if one is incorporating provisions specifically dealing with these sorts of situations?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Heidi. I think that may have been David, in fact, David Franchetti, that sent that on behalf of Heidi. So I think if we take one last question, and where are we, guys? Apologise. We're from Anthony Booth. Anthony asks, where you have taken a lease and the property has previously been altered and these works are structurally defective, causing disrepair, will the new tenant be responsible for putting the property back into repair, i.e. remedying the structural works that have not been correctly carried out prior to the tenant taking out the new lease? Thank you, Anthony.
Oh, that's a 20-minute answer, that one. The short answer is that if the problem arises from what's often referred to as an inherent defect in the building, some defects in the construction or the design of the building, that does not necessarily take it outside the scope of the tenant's repairing obligation. If that inherent defect has caused disrepair, and the disrepair falls within the tenant's repairing obligation and it has to address that disrepair, then it may be that the only sensible and appropriate way of addressing the disrepair is to address the underlying inherent defect, and it may well be part of the tenant's obligation. And the only real kind of limitation on that arising out of the case law is the limitation that the tenant cannot be required by way of repair to do something which involves the landlord getting back at the end of the lease a wholly different building from that which was let to the tenant. That's the kind of distinction which judges seem to find helpful, which I think is enormously difficult to apply in practice. But that's really the only kind of limitation on that. But it is certainly possible that could be within the tenant's repairing obligation.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Anthony, for that question. So I think we'll close the questions off there. But please, if anyone does have any other questions for myself or Mark or any of my colleagues, please do feel free to get in touch. So just to close off, thank you to Mark and to everyone for attending today's webinar. You will receive an automated email from GoToWebinar in the next 24 hours. If you respond to that, the replies come through to myself, but I can also forward anything on, any queries you may have or any feedback you have to Mark, and we can go from there. You will also receive a separate email from Robert Kelly, my colleague, which will contain the notes and the slides for today's session. And again, if you have any questions for Robert, please do feel free to reach out to him. Mark, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to everyone for joining. On behalf of Stewart Title and Mark, wish you a very good end to your day. So thanks, and see you again soon. Goodbye.